All right, if you'll turn to Jeremiah chapter 1 real quick. Jeremiah, the first chapter. And in Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 1, we read, it says, "The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priest were at Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign, and it also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, the king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah." Now those three kings, we've talked about this a bunch of times, but those three kings are kind of the historical marker, the historical background for when Mr. Jeremiah did his work. Those three kings were not the only three kings that were around when Jeremiah did his work. There were a couple more that aren't named in that list because they were only on the throne a matter of months. But the three that are mentioned here were there for several years. And those three kings were among the last five that ruled over the nation of Judah before it was carried away by the Babylonians, before it was conquered and all the people were carried away or destroyed or whatever. So why is that important? Well, here today in our lesson in chapter 24, we start off with a statement that puts us somewhere in that time frame, and we can tell where we are in that time frame by what is said here at the beginning of the chapter. So let's just read this first verse together, and I think it'll become clear what we're talking about. It says, after Nebuchadnezzar, and we know Nebuchadnezzar, he's that historical figure who was the greatest of the Babylonian kings, who came down from a lineage of several kings, but here he is now kind of at the apex of power for the Babylonian nation, conquering all these nations that surrounded them, unifying them into one grand empire. So after Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away captive Jeconiah, the son of Jehoiakim. Now, if you'll remember, back in chapter 1, Jehoiakim is mentioned in the middle of those. He's the middle guy in the list of those three guys. But there's no mention of Jeconiah. Well, who was Jeconiah? Well, we know from other parts of the Old Testament, he was Jehoiakim, his son. And he goes by other names in the Old Testament. A lot of these guys had multiple names, and Jeconiah was no different. He was also known as Jehoiachin, and also in other parts of Jeremiah, he's called Coniah. So you run into that several times. But the historical point that Jeremiah chapter 24 is pointing us to is the moment when Jehoiakim's son is carried away in captivity. All right, everybody got that? Everybody agree with that? Now, is he the only person mentioned as being carried away in captivity here? Who else? Okay, you kind of get a, I'm sorry? Yeah, and we're not told this in Scripture, but why do you think these folks are mentioned as having been taken away? Okay, yeah, I mean, if you're a foreign king and you come into town and you want to kind of build your kingdom up back home, you're going to take the best that land has to offer physically and from a people standpoint, right? Okay, that could be part of it as well. Very good. So he takes away, as he mentions here, the officials of Judah. That would be these other people in the government that aren't necessarily the king, craftsmen and smiths, and he brings them all back to where? They all go back to Babylon. Now, if you'll turn over real quick to Daniel chapter 1, just a little sidebar here that's kind of interesting. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, it says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, besieged it, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand." And then as you go down through there and read, stuff was taken away from Jerusalem and people, including Daniel. So this has happened once before. In fact, what you read, if you put all the things that the Old Testament has to say about what happens to Jerusalem during this time, it's like every time they would get out of line or rebel, Nebuchadnezzar would show up and take some folks away. And he did that 3 times, and the last time he just destroyed it. So the first time was when Jehoiakim was on the throne. The second time seems to be right here, where his son is on the throne for only 3 months. And then the last time will be when the last king is around. Okay, so anyway, back to Jeremiah chapter 24. Now, during this moment of time, God shows Jeremiah what? Anybody, if you've read this chapter? It's a vision of what? 2 baskets of figs, right? Did you notice where he was when he had this vision? Because we're told there in verse, where? Yeah, it's the before the temple of the Lord, and people who know the way the temple service was carried out at that time have said that this is where you would customarily bring offerings, including produce offerings, first fruit offerings. And that's very likely what Jeremiah is seeing in a vision form, perhaps, is them bringing the first fruits of the fig harvest. Okay? So naturally, just like in any harvest, you see some good and some not so good, right? So he sees, in fact, God asks him, what do you see, Jeremiah? That's down in verse 3, and Jeremiah says what? Okay, some good figs that are really good looking and some bad figs that are really bad looking, right? Okay. All right, so that's what he sees, and now beginning in verse 4, we get the explanation. Because God wasn't just interested in the figs, right? He had a reason for showing him that. So verse 4 says, Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Thus says the Lord God of Israel, like these, which ones? Which figs? Good figs, all right, we're talking about that. I'm going to regard what? What is he comparing the good figs to? The captives, okay? The folks that just got hauled off to Babylon out of their native homeland, all right? All right, so what about these folks? What is God's plan for them as you read down through verse 7? For their own good? Okay, all right. Everybody agree with that? Anybody have anything else to add to that?
He's going to do things in a way that they will turn, they will look back. He's saying look back to him.
Okay.
Because they're lost without him. That's what I get out of it.
Okay.
That's his purpose and part of his purpose.
Okay, all right. All right, anybody else? Okay, Tim just hit on 2 of the metaphors used to describe what God's plans were there, right? Building and planting. And in regard to building, he says, I'm going to build them and not overthrow them. That's kind of what you did if you were an invading army and you came into somebody's city or town and you wanted to destroy it. You would overthrow all the buildings. You'd pull them down and destroy them, right? Well, God says, I'm not doing that to these folks that I'm sending to Babylon. I'm going to build them up and I'm going to plant them so they can grow and flourish and all that kind of stuff. All right?
Well, I remember that when, going back to the first chapter of Jeremiah, there's a phrase there's where God's telling him there to root out, to pull down, to destroy, to throw in, to build, and to plant. It's not just something he thought of all of a sudden.
Okay.
This has been his plan.
Great point.
For a long time.
Great point. All right. All right. And as Ms. Frankie pointed out earlier, it says in verse 7, there was a purpose for all this, and that was so that they would have a heart to know me. And like we've said in here several times, this is not just oh, I know about God, right? This is a heart that truly knows and is in fellowship and understands what God's will is and does it. All of that is wrapped up in that phrase, to truly know God, all right? And that's what he's looking for. I will give them a heart to know me, for I am the Lord, and they will be my people. When that happens, that's what the result of it is. They belong to God. I will be their God, and they will return to me in what manner? What does it say there? Wholehearted, okay? So the purpose of all of this that he's telling the people through Jeremiah is so that when these folks are sent away, they're going to be changed, built up, planted, and when they come back, they're going to be my people, truly, as they should, all right? Okay, questions on that? Let's ask one more question about that. Let's imagine you lived in Jerusalem at that time. Which group would you choose to be in? The group that got hauled off or the group that's still there? Well, pretend you didn't know what we just talked about. I should have said that. Which group, from a human standpoint, would you have rather been in? The group that stayed, right? Yeah. So the irony in this chapter is, here are the folks who may have thought of themselves as the unfortunate ones, the folks who are left behind who may have thought of themselves as the lucky ones, when in actuality, the lucky ones were the ones that were hauled away. Because they're going to be the ones that are going to be changed, and they're going to become the ones who have a heart for God. So things don't always work out the way we see with our human eyes, right? God's ways are different than that. Okay. All right, let's continue here in verse 8. Any comments or questions down through this? Okay. Different, okay. All right. All right, well, let's see what we've talked about the good figs, so who do you think he's going to talk about next? Yeah, the bad figs, right? All right. Verse 8 says, but like the bad figs, which cannot be eaten due to rottenness, indeed, thus says the Lord, so I will, and he's going to say some plans he has for the group that's still there. And what are those plans? Give them up. What else? What do you think that means? Right, that's in verse 10, but verse 9, when he says, I will make them a terror and an evil for all the kingdoms of the earth. What does that mean? Okay. All right. What else? Does that mean they're going to be tough people wherever they go? Everybody's going to be afraid of them? People will be after them? Okay. What else? Let's imagine I'm sorry? That would be punished? Okay. Let's imagine that these folks are scattered and they come to live in a foreign land, and you know through the grapevine, let's say you're living in one of these foreign lands, you know what's happened to the nation of Judah. And here is somebody now living next door to you who was from Judah, who is now living in your country. And you talk to them about what happened. And if they're honest, maybe they tell you, well, we didn't behave the way we should, and God did this to us, and here we are. What do you think the effect that would have upon those people when they hear that kind of news? Would it cause them to fear? Maybe a little. At least maybe give them a reason to pause. Or maybe they could be also look at these folks as a terror and an evil, because now here they are in our country having been under the judgment of God. You know, who knows? It could have been all those things. And of course it goes on to say there in verse 9, I will make them a reproach and a proverb and a taunt and a curse in all the places where I will scatter them. They'll also carry a stigma from having been cast out of their native homeland for the things that God is punishing them for, right? Okay, so that'll follow them as well. And then in verse 10, he goes on to say, I will send sword, famine, and pestilence. Those are three warfare bad things that happen to people, right? I will send that upon them until they are destroyed from the land which I gave to them and their forefathers. So that's what fate awaits the folks who are left and didn't get taken away into captivity. Okay? I don't know. Could be either one. Not sure. Good question, but I don't know. Anybody else have an answer to that? Okay. All right. So just as a way of kind of summarizing this chapter, let's look at the verbs that describe God's actions in this chapter. All right. Let's just do that mentally together. Let's start back up in verse 5. What is God going to do there? How about, I will regard as good the captives of Judah? That's a good thing, right? God regards you as good, something that he's going to work with. That's a good thing. What about verse 6? What's God going to do there? Set my eyes on them, watch over them. All right. Another good thing he's got planned on them. What else in verse 6? Build them up. Okay. Bring them back to this land. What else? Plant them. Okay, very good. What about in verse 7? I'm going to give them a heart to know me. So does that mean God's just going to zap them? And without, all of a sudden they're going to become mindless zombies with good hearts? Okay, all right, very good, very good. Yeah, what I'm looking for there is practically how do you think that worked out? Because I don't think God just zapped them and they suddenly had good hearts, right? I think there was a process there through divine providence where brought out of the environment they were in, brought to a strange land where things might not have been pleasant, which might have caused them to get their minds reoriented towards God for help. All those things have been part of the actual working of how God gave them a new heart. Okay? Did you have your hand up? Yes.
Makes me wonder what the role was for Daniel and others, besides what we read about. What role did they play in teaching and restoring and whatnot? If you look at Daniel now, he talks about reading what's in Jeremiah 25. So there was an awareness of that. And Ezekiel was there. So there were good people planning what God planted them there so that they could teach and lead those who are reminded to have heart of people, that they could know God so that they went back, they were prepared to build the temple and do the things eventually.
Okay. All right. Very good.
I know sometime in the beginning when we started studying this, there was a difference in knowing about God and knowing God. And that's, they're still trying to, he's trying to get them through all this
Work through that.
process. Yeah, to work through all of it.
All right. Did you have something, Tim? Were you?
During that process that you talked about, they probably wrote, they didn't have email and text and all that, they probably knew what was going on back then.
Mhm.
And probably over that period of time, that process was, we are working. God said he was gonna do it, he did it, and we better be straight.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right. Anybody else? Okay, there are some negative verbs down in verses 8, 9, and 10 as well. Like you might say the flip side of this. Verse 8, God says, I will abandon Zedekiah. That would be the last king. And that's a serious thing for God to say about you. And not just Zedekiah, but his officials and the remnant. Everybody who's in Jerusalem, in other words. At the end there, God says, I'm abandoning you. I'm leaving you to your fate, in other words. What about verse 9? We talked about this, right? I will make them a terror and reproach and all those things. And then verse 10, I will send the sword, famine, and pestilence. So that's the flip side of the good things that God was going to do in the earlier verses. Okay, that's all I had planned to say on that chapter. Anybody have any questions or observations you'd like to make before we go on? All right, let's go on to chapter 25 then. Okay, chapter 25 opens kind of the same way as chapter 24. We get a historical marker, and this is another one of those instances where Jeremiah is not necessarily chronological. Chapter 24, we just talked about the son of Jehoiakim. Here in chapter 25, we're talking about Jehoiakim himself. So we've got something that actually occurs earlier than what we just talked about. Okay, so the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah concerning who? Who's this dealing with? People in Judah. All right. And it occurs in what year of Jehoiakim's reign? 4th year. So he's been on the throne 4 years. And we got a little interesting marker there at the end of verse 1 that also gives us an important date, and this is about Nebuchadnezzar. What does it say about him? 1st year of his reign. Now, just to show you something, I think this will kind of tie into some of the things we just talked about with Daniel. Turn over to Daniel chapter 2. This is the famous vision or the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had of the golden image. And notice when this happens. Daniel 2, verse 1. Somebody want to read that for me?
Now the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him.
Okay. What year of his reign? 2nd year. All right. So, it would be an interesting study to look at what's going on over in Babylon with Daniel and all those guys. We know this is happening versus what's still going on back in the homeland. All right. But anyway, here we are now in the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, when what is going to be said here in chapter 25 is about to be said. Now, what is this chapter about? Anybody, if you've read this, what are we going to talk about here? All right, that's one thing. What? 70 years of captivity are announced. What else? Is Judah the only nation that's dealt with in this chapter? Who else is talked about, ma'am? Babylon's talked about. Egypt. In fact, there's a long list of nations that are mentioned in here. Some of them specifically, some under a general heading that are going to be in some way addressed by things that Jeremiah has to say through here. Now, before we get into all those details, what does that fact alone tell you about God? Is he just worried about one little group over here? All right, he does. He's aware of what's going on in the whole world, right? And he has, even though Israel and Judah at this time are his special covenant people, all nations were still accountable to him. And that's because what he's going to announce in this chapter is judgment on all of them. Okay, so the Bible writers are, I think, careful, inspired writers, to show us that while we focus so much on Israel in the Old Testament, the other nations weren't just totally forgotten. God still dealt with them and still knew what they were doing. Okay. Now, another thing that we're told here in this chapter, we get some nuts and bolts, you might say, is how long Jeremiah has been on the job. How long has that been? 23 years, right? So he's been doing his work, spreading whatever message God gave him to the people. And what had been the result, according to Jeremiah, during that 23-year period? Hadn't listened, all right? And that's been one of Jeremiah's recurring themes in a lot of his sermons, right? Blah, 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 but you're not listening. Blah, 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 but you're not listening, right? In fact, the only people they were listening to, if you go back a few chapters, was who? Who had they listened to? The false prophets, yeah. And Jeremiah had to, ma'am? Yeah, that's right. They had a message that they liked hearing. So, yeah, that's the overall theme, though, there at the end of verse 3. I have spoken to you again and again, but you have not listened. And then he kind of broadens the scope, not just what he had been involved in, but what God has done over that same period of time through other people as well, right? Verse 4, and the Lord has sent to you all his servants, the prophets. And there's that same phrase again, right? Again and again. Not just one, not just a few, but several. And the same result. You have not listened nor inclined your ear to hear. And the message of Jeremiah and those prophets is kind of summarized in verse 5. And what is that? Turn from your evil way and from the evil of your deeds, and the result will be you get to stay put. Yeah, pretty simple message, right? I mean, this is so easy a fifth grader can understand it, right? All right. Verse 6 kind of goes on and adds some more of the details of that. Do not go after other gods to serve them and to worship them. And do not, what else? Provoke me to anger with the works of your hands. What is that talking about? Okay, that's right. So he's referring to the fact that these idols, they spend a lot of time and effort to make them beautiful and decorate them, doing all this stuff, the works of their hands. And all it was doing in reality was making God angry. And if they would do all that, again at the end of verse 6 is, I will do you no harm. But verse 7 comes back to the reality of the situation. They had not listened. And in order that you might provoke me to anger with the works of your hands, and all of that was hurting who ultimately? Hurting themselves, right? To your own harm. Okay, so that was kind of a little summary there of Jeremiah's work and the other prophets at that time. All right?
It's kind of hard to think about them seeing what God, I mean, they saw what God did for them. I mean, it wasn't just God saying, they saw what God did for them.
Okay.
And then there's this little thing sitting on the counter over there that's made up and that does nothing for them. And that's what they're looking at. They're looking at that instead of, if we get anything out of that, we ought to understand how we have to really think about it and keep our minds on God, because they saw it. They were right there seeing God do things and still stepped away from it or moved away from it.
Okay.
It's why I think that's part of why we see all of this in the studies, is because he wants us to know.
Right. Yeah, because like we've said so many times, we're totally different than those folks were back then, right? Yeah, not really. Not really. Okay, I think the first bell is rung, right? Okay, well, let's just hold off on going through any more, because we'll pick up on that Wednesday night. Any other comments or questions before we are dismissed? Borders on insanity, yep. Anybody else? All right, appreciate your attention.